Well, tonight is the beginning of the Jewish holiday of Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer means the 33rd day in the counting of the Omer. And we're going to talk about that in just a second, but I want to kind of give some background to what does that mean, the 33rd day in the counting of the Omer. So Passover comes and there's this excitement about the next coming holiday. We left Egypt with the intention of traveling to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. So it was a tremendous amount of excitement of the journey to come. And so people were, when you're excited about upcoming a date, you count down the days. So that's one piece of it. It's the excitement of the upcoming holiday of Shavuos. Also, there's an interesting, there's a commandment that it's part of the harvest season, right? So when Passover comes in, it's the early part of the season. It's the early part of the harvest season in Israel. And the first of the grains to be harvested, the first of the grains is barley. And so the grain sacrifice that begins in the temple at this time is the barley offering. How much?
I can't do this. I think I'll.
You have a little bit here. Here we go. So the harvest is barley, and we begin bringing as part of the daily sacrifices. We bring a barley sacrifice as part of the daily sacrifices. How much barley is considered, and it's called an Omer. The measurement is called an Omer. How much is an Omer? So as if there is a bowl of grain, the Kohen would put his hand towards the bowl of grain, 3 fingers closed, and then pull those fingers over into the grain, pull it up, wipe it off with his side fingers. That amount is an Omer. That's how much an Omer is, okay? Kohen would take his hand, put it in the bowl, curl those 3 fingers, wipe off the extra, and that's an Omer of grain. And from starting with Passover, that Omer offering is from the barley grain. And we bring that every day until Shavuos, the holiday of the giving of the Torah, at which point we now start bringing a wheat offering. Now, what's interesting is we kind of put all these pieces together, right? So when the Jews left Egypt, we were slaves to slaves. We were the lowest class in the system, just the lowest of the low, and we'd been sunken into the 49th gate of impurity, and it was just a really bad scene. And yet, 7 weeks later, we're going to convene at Mount Sinai and receive God's holy Torah. There's a lot of personal improvement that has to go on in that time for all of us to prepare to receive God's holy Torah, God's wisdom in the Torah itself. So how do you prepare? Introspection, goal of what we want to be, and a realization of where we are and the gap in between and how to deal with that. There's 7 midos, 7 types of emotional statuses, right? We have wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, which are the intellectual pieces, and then there's the emotional ones, which are the 7 different chesed, gevura, tiferes. There's kindness, there's severity, there's beauty, which is a combination of the both, and there's 7 different sets of those emotional attributes. But each attribute has each of the other attributes within it as well. So it's the chesed within chesed, kindness within kindness, the epitome of kindness within kindness. But there's also a certain amount of severity within kindness, the time to hold back and knowing how much kindness to give. And so there's 7 sets of 7. Each one is a combination of how to put those together. Those correspond to 7 weeks. 7 sets of 7 emotions corresponds to 7 weeks, in each one trying to modify and purify and to change the way we see things and the way we behave. So 7 sets of 7. That's the 7 weeks between between the Exodus of Egypt and receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. Interestingly enough, the barley grain is also considered Michael Behema, which is animal fodder. Right? So it's really from Passover, we have to take care of the animal instincts of ourselves to refine all of those until we reach the giving of the Torah, at which point, from that point, we switch off to wheat, and we try and again, take only the holy side forward, but having acknowledged the work that we did on the animal aspects of this. So when we talk about the Omer, the counting of the days between Passover and Shavuos, the counting of the Omer offering that's brought in the temple from animal fodder during this 7 weeks, as we try to improve ourselves and grow ourselves, right? The 33rd day in the counting of the Omer doesn't always fall out on the exact same Hebrew calendar date, because depending on the sighting of the moon and when the month of Nisan begins, and then you have Passover, so it can shift. Rosh Hashanah is on the first day of Tishrei. Sukkot is on, Yom Kippur is on the 10th day of Tishrei. Sukkot is on the 15th day of Tishrei. Passover is on the 15th of Nisan. Shavuos is the biblical holiday that is not designated to a day of the calendar, but rather it's designated by the improvement date from Passover. So whenever Passover fell out, we count the 7 sets of 7 weeks, and on the 50th day, that is Shavuos. Now, since the time of Ezra HaSefer, Ezra the scribe, since that time, the calendar has pretty much been set. We know what the calendar will look like, and we go by an established calendar now. And so we don't have the same thing of waiting for witnesses to see the moon and then come to the temple and testify that they saw the moon, and then the court establishes the days of the month. We don't do that anymore. We have a set calendar. Since Ezra HaSefer, Ezra the scribe set it up, we follow that calendar. Nevertheless, it's important for us to understand that the biblical concept of Shavuos is based on when Passover becomes. It's the 50th day after Passover. So that's an established time. This 33rd day in the counting of the Omer is the Yartzeit, the anniversary of passing of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. And we want to talk about that tonight. So the text I sent you, hopefully you have it printed out or you have it up on the screen. We're going to look inside this. This text is based on an oral discourse that was given on Lag BaOmer in the Hebrew year of 5733. And it's adapted from one of the discourses that the Lubavitcher Rebbe said at that time. Lag BaOmer commemorates the passing of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Who was he? He was one of the foremost sages of the Talmud, and he was the author of the Zohar, which is the primary text of Kabbalah, the mystical teachings. So we already see that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was a sage of the Talmudic era, so the whole legal side of the Talmud. He was a great sage of that time, but also he was the author of the Zohar, so he also had a tremendous insight into the Kabbalistic work, the mystical teachings. Rabbi Shimon's knowledge extended from the exoteric legal realm of the Torah to the deepest mystical secrets. Moreover, he was uniquely able to perceive these two areas of knowledge not as distinct, self-contained disciplines, but as one composite unit. The legal aspect being the body, the mystical element as the soul of one integrated Torah. So Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was able to study a piece of Torah, understand the legal ramifications of what that meant, but also understand the spiritual side of that whole thing and how those relate, how they correlate. So this is a big thing, because oftentimes in our history we find people who they're really great at the legal stuff, but they don't seem to have a spiritual side to them. Or people who are lofty and spiritual, but practically speaking, so there's two sides to that. And Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai had a unification of both of those. This unity within the Torah, which Rabbi Shimon recognized, this enabled him to perceive the divine unity within our material world, and moreover, to have this unity expressed in actual fact as well as in the abstract. So most of us, we look at the physical world and we see the physical world. Rabbi Shimon was able to look at the physical world and see the spiritual aspect within it, as if to say, my dining room table has been there for a long time. It has traveled with us over the last 40 years from when we got married. It's the same original table we had. It's been from Long Beach, California, to Sydney, Australia, to Tampa, Florida, Worcester, Massachusetts, and 3 different locations within Chicago. It's the same table. It's just a wooden table. But at the same time, if you stop and think, how many Shabbosim were celebrated at that table? How many Yomim Tovim were celebrated at that table? How many discussion classes and Torah classes sat around that table? I don't perceive the godliness that has been absorbed into that table from all of those occasions. But Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, he would see that. And he would see that as equal as he would see the physical table itself. He understood Torah study as an all-encompassing, able to influence and control every aspect of our lives. So for him, this idea of living Torah was a very real part of a very real thing, and something that completely embodied him. Thus, the Zohar actually relates that Eretz Yisrael, there's a story from the Zohar that in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, they once suffered a severe drought. When the Jews appealed to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai for his help with the drought, let's hold there for just a second. I'm going to come back to this. There's a note here, note number 2. The Talmud records a number of cases in which various sages had their prayers for rain answered. So in other words, if there was a drought and the community would pray and things weren't resultant, they would specifically go to one of the sages of the time. The sage would pray and his intervention made a difference and it would rain. But what's unique here, let's go back to the sentence above. When the Jews appealed to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai for his help, he expounded upon a verse from the book of Psalms. How good and how pleasant is it for brothers to dwell together. And it began to rain. He didn't pray. He quoted a verse of Torah. And it started raining. In the same vein, the Medrash relates that one of Rabbi Shimon's students returned to Eretz Yisrael. He came to Israel after acquiring wealth in foreign lands. He was a businessman. And seeing that some of his other students grew envious of this guy's wealth, they sat and learned the whole time. This guy went off, did some business, and came back wealthy. Rabbi Shimon led them to a valley, and he called out, "Valley, valley, fill up with gold coins." And it did. And Rabbi Shimon said, anyone who wants to take, go ahead and take, but be aware that you are taking from your portion in the world to come. You're granted so much, you can have it now, you can have it later. You can have it here in the physical realm, or you can have it in the spiritual realm. Make it. So we see here that Rabbi Shimon was able to make the spiritual wealth of the world to come and somehow manifest that into material wealth in this world. The veil between the two worlds is a very thin veil. But most of us can't see past it and certainly can't manipulate it.
Well, there's always a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
There's a fascinating story about, well, let's get through this. Otherwise I'll get, get distracted. So on Lag BaOmer, we seek to emulate this quality of Rabbi Shimon, this quality of being able to see both sides. Someone's got a phone going off. You might want to.
I'll stop it. Excuse me.
So on this day, it is customary for young yeshiva students to leave the halls of study and go out to the fields. It's a day of picnics. Lag BaOmer is typically a day of picnics, and the schools all go out and they go out to the fields and they make a picnic. The intent of this custom is obviously not to mark Rabbi Shimon's yard site by taking a vacation from the study of Torah, but rather to bring the yeshiva out into the fields. Rabbi Shimon was able to unite the deepest mystical element of the Torah with the natural elements of the world. And in emulation of him, children extend the atmosphere of the yeshiva to encompass even the fields and areas seemingly beyond the realm of Torah. So typically we study inside the yeshiva. Now we go outside and we have a picnic and we do some Torah studies and we do some games and things to extend this concept that Judaism is not an ascetic spiritual, but a physical mundane.
Aren't bonfires also like a big thing from this holiday? And why would that be?
Hold that question. Let's come back to it. But yes, it's going out into the world and having a picnic and enjoying the fresh air while continuing the Torah studies as well and elevating the physical with the spiritual as well. Bonfires comes back. I don't think it's actually going to come up in here. But what's interesting is when Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai passed away and they buried him, his burial site was surrounded by a pillar of fire that went up into the heavens, as if to say, this one's different. So we celebrate with a bonfire, but also bonfires is part of going out and celebrating the outdoors. Rabbi Shimon taught that the underlying unity of Torah and worldliness should be expressed every day, not only once a year on Lag BaOmer, but every day. And in light of this, we can understand a classic Talmudic debate on the pasuk, on the verse, "This Torah scroll shall not depart from your mouth." In other words, the idea that we should be learning all the time, that we should spend our entire day sitting and learning and talking words of Torah. Rabbi Shimon maintained that the pasuk cannot be taken literally. Excuse me, Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael maintains that the verse cannot be taken literally. Rather, as much time as possible should be devoted to Torah study, but part of one's time has to be devoted to earning a parnasa, making a livelihood. You got to live. Rabbi Shimon, however, he argued that the pasuk should be taken at face value. A person should devote all of his time and effort to Torah study, leaving it to God to figure out how the material needs will be met. You devote yourself 100% to Torah studies, and God will take care of the rest of it. Rabbi Shimon was true to his own teachings. The Talmud says of Rabbi Shimon, that his profession was Torah. He devoted himself solely to the Torah study, remaining completely uninvolved in worldly concerns. That his worldliness was completely Torah. That was how he combined it. And he was able to do that. But the question now becomes, is Rabbi Shimon's view relevant to us? Summing up the debate, the Talmud, Masechta Brachos, says, many followed the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael and were successful. There are many people who made Torah their entire day and their evening and night, never went to work, and somehow they lived, and somehow they were sustained, and God took care of it.
Did they get married?
Yes, married and have children.
That's all right.
Yep, because that's a Torah obligation as well.
Okay.
Yep. But others followed the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, and they weren't successful. Didn't work for them. Now, in further studies, we may find that it depends on the attitude and one's capacity to truly believe that this is the right way to go and truly dedicate themselves to it, and therefore it works for them. But for someone who doesn't have that same level of dedication, that same level of perception, it's not going to work for them. As we studied in Chavos Levavos last week, everyone has to know their own capacity, their own pensions, right? So if someone is not very scholarly to dedicate his day to living like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he's not going to have a whole lot of success with that. But someone who's a great Torah scholar, to be spending his time on something else could be totally a waste of his time. He could be doing much more. But then you also have to question is how much does he truly believe that God will provide for him, and how much does he get worried about what's going on, right? Some followed Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it worked. Many tried and it didn't work. And this is already recorded in the Mishnah 2,000 years ago, right? Although Rabbi Shimon himself was able to function at this exalted level, it appears to be beyond the grasp of most people. And there's a note at the bottom here, note number 10. It appears that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai himself ultimately, towards the latter end of his life, he ultimately appreciated that this level of devotion was beyond the potential for most folks. Thus, in Shabbos, in the Gemara Shabbos, page 33 on the second column, the second Amud, the second side, it relates that when Rabbi Shimon and his son Rabbi Elazar emerged from their 13-year ordeal in a cave, they encountered people involved in their day-to-day affairs, and Rabbi Elazar, his son, was unable to understand how could people abandon the eternal life, Torah study, and occupy themselves with temporal concerns. And Rabbi Shimon placated him, saying, "You and I are sufficient for the world," meaning if there's even only two people that totally devote themselves, that's sufficient. The bulk of the world has to earn a living and study Torah and not make Torah their full-time occupation. So his latter years, he understood that. What were they doing in a cave? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai lived at a time in the Roman Empire when they forbade the study of Torah. It was a capital punishment. If caught, it was a death sentence. And yet he continued to publicize and teach and to publicly teach until it came necessary for him to hide at the risk of his life. And he and his son, they hid in a cave. And outside the cave, there was a small stream that went past, and there was a carob tree. And essentially, they lived off of water and carob for 13 years while living in a cave, preoccupying themselves the whole time with the learning of Torah. So it was a very minimalistic existence, but he and his son did that together. Obviously, he was married; he already had children. He had fulfilled those mitzvahs already, but they set 13 years. They stayed there. When they came out, there was a certain culture shock again, both ways for those who knew them as well as for they themselves. So we have this teaching from the Mishnah that talks about Torah Shemanaseh, that Torah should be one's life. And Rabbi Shimon was able to do that, but most of us are not able to do that. So it's included in the Mishnah. Mishnah is always there to teach us something. So I'm not able to do that. What is the Mishnah trying to tell me? I can't do that. I'm too ADHD, man. There's no way I can do that. So how? So what is this telling me, right? How then are we to understand this teaching? So our sages note that the Torah was given only to those, the Jews in the wilderness, who ate the manna. when the Torah was given, it was given that first time around, the Torah was given to the Jews that lived in the desert. They had for 7 weeks, they were living a totally spiritual existence. They left Egypt. They're working on improving themselves. They did not have to do any manual labor anymore. They did not have to do any work to provide for themselves. God gave them food to drink, food to eat, water to drink from the well of Miriam. He plowed the road ahead of them, provided the Anan HaKavod, the clouds of glory above them to shelter them. Literally, the entire day could be spent in self-improvement. Everything was provided. Those Jews who lived in the desert and everything was given to them, that's who the Torah was given to. So what does that mean? This means that the statement is not intended to limit the number of people who have access to Torah study. Instead, it aims to teach us how we should approach it. While our ancestors received their food from heaven, they did not have to worry about earning a living. And with all their needs miraculously provided for, they were able to concentrate their energies on spiritual growth alone, nothing else. We, by contrast, we do not enjoy overt miracles, and we must therefore spend a certain amount of time involved with worldly concerns. Nonetheless, during the time that we do study Torah, all of our cares and worries, all of our concerns for material affairs, they should be set aside. And in this manner, during the time we have designated for Torah study, we can approach the level of those who ate manna and emulate Rabbi Shimon's state of Torah soy manaseh, the Torah was his study. When we have time to study Torah every day, and we set aside a time, dedicated time, that we're going to sit and study Torah, and we may have subjects that we've already set aside that we're going to study. There's a certain amount of Chumash studies I do every day. There's a Tanya study I do every day. There's a Mishnah Torah from the Rambam I study every day. The Hayom Yom from the Rebbe's teachings I study every day. Additionally, at least once a week I study Halacha. Additionally, at least once a week I study a discourse from the Rebbe. And then there's the classes that we have and we share together. Those things are set at times to study Torah and to learn Torah. During that time, the rest of the world doesn't exist. Except for my wife's, if she phone calls or my mother's phone call. I don't answer. I don't answer any calls. The phone is set to silence, right? So we set those times as times set aside. And in Hebrew, we talk about a kviyas zman, an established time. I try and do the bulk of my regular studies, Chumash and Tanya and Hayom Yom and Rambam. I try and do all those things first thing in the morning before I go to work. So I do my morning prayers. I do those studies. Then I can deal with the world. But by and large, those things come first. And during that time, that's the focus. The Rebbe talks about that's a kviyas zman, a set established time, right? We have our class every Wednesday night, 6:30 Central. It's an established time. That's a kviyas zman. That's an established time. The Rebbe talks about a kviyas benefesh, an established thing in the soul. I can't go to sleep if I didn't do my Chumash and Tanya and Tehillim. It's so ingrained that there's certain things we know we have to do, and we can't not do them. It's so established and so ingrained within us. Putting on tefillin. It used to be when I was younger, I get caught up in the day, and I might daven with the morning minyan, and I put on my tefillin with the morning minyan, but I have a second pair of tefillin that goes according to Rabbeinu Tam, in which order the parshas are inside the tefillin. And I remember in my younger years, there would be times when I would get caught up in other things that I have to do, and I might not put on Rabbeinu Tam's until later. And I was worried that I would forget. So I put my tefillin on my left hand. I wear my watch on my left hand. So I always put my watch. I didn't put it down when I was putting on tefillin. I didn't put it on the table. I put my watch on my right hand. And I wouldn't switch it back to the left hand until I put on my Rabbeinu Tam's. So there was this constant discomfort throughout the day. You didn't put on Rabbeinu Tam's yet. No matter what I was doing, there was this constant discomfort. I didn't put on Rabbeinu Tam tefillin yet. It's kind of like the same reminder of, you tie the little ribbon around your finger to remember that you're something you're supposed to remember to do, right? So it's this constant reminder. But a kaviyas benefesh, something which is established in your soul, you can't not do that thing. It bothers you until it's completed. So it's not just a task you want to tick off on your list. It's a task that weighs on you until it's completed. That's a kaviyas benefesh. That's already something established in the soul. We want to be like Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, if not the whole day, at least the time that we're studying Torah. In that time, it's a kaviyas benefesh. It's established in the soul. In that time, the Torah, that's the whole occupation. Nothing else exists. The Alter Rebbe explains that fulfilling a mitzvah establishes an eternal union with the divine. Thus, studying Torah, even briefly, but with undivided attentiveness, just like those who ate the manna, they weren't distracted by responsibilities of food and shelter. It was all provided. They totally gave their attention to their Torah studies. When we give ourselves over to that time and study and are totally immersed in our studies in that time, that affirms us in a timeless bond with God at the level of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So much so that even after such Torah study, when we go back into our regular things, when a person turns his attention to the material concerns, that inner connection is established. Because the spiritual world is not restricted by time and space. The Torah study that we do when we're totally devoted, when we're totally into it, is beyond time and space. So even when we go back to our time and space restrictions of the physical world, that time we were invested is sacred, and it stays with us. It carries us forward. And so when we learn this Mishnah and we learn about this level of studying that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai had, the Torah was his livelihood, that was his life. We can do that. We can do that for this small little window that we have reserved for our Torah studies. But because it's Torah studies, it's God's infinite will and wisdom, it's beyond time and space, and therefore it carries us forward beyond time and space. In the era of the redemption, in the time of Mashiach, the fusion between the material world and the spiritual world that's exemplified by the way Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai would live, this will be reflected throughout the world. The world will come to know this and feel this. And through spreading Rabbi Shimon's teachings and talking about the coming of redemption, learning about the ideas of the coming redemption, we can hasten this. How do we hasten it? You can't look forward to something you don't understand. You can't get excited about something that means nothing to you. By learning about Mashiach and learning about what the era of Mashiach will look like, and grasping a concept of how could world peace actually exist, how could world famine actually disappear, what would that take? It would take a leadership like Mashiach the whole world recognizes, and the whole world becomes attuned to spirituality, and that's like someone turning on a light in a dark room and the fighting stops because everyone realizes the stupidity of it. That light in the darkness that's brought out by Torah studies and brought out by Hasidic teachings, that is its coming Mashiach. And when we stop to think about it, we become very excited about that, and we become invested in making that happen. As the Raya Mehemna, that's a sefer, a book called Raya Mehemna, and it's a quoting there. Raya Mehemna states that because eventually the Jewish people will taste of the tree of life, which is the book of Zohar, they will go out of exile with it in mercy. May this take place speedily and in our days. So what does this mean, the tree of life? So if we go back to the beginning of creation, the creation story that's in Genesis, the book of Genesis. So God created the world, Adam and Chava, man and wife, and they lived in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden. And in the Garden of Eden, they could eat anything that was there. The fruit, the trees tasted like the fruit of the trees. There was a spiritual light that lit up the world. It was a time of peace. Lion would lie with the lamb, and the child could play with a serpent. That's what it looked like back then. But we had one commandment: don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Once we tasted the idea of good and evil, then that became mixed up in the world. And God hid the tree of life, the idea that there would be death in the world, came about at that time. Once the evil is removed from the husk, and we have that time of Mashiach coming, then we'll be able to taste from the tree of life. Eternal life will be available, and we'll all have those things that we look forward to most, which is the idea that we can sit and learn Torah and begin to grasp whatever is humanly possible of God's will and wisdom without the restrictions of having to work for a living and earn a living, and without the constraints of other nations' rules we have to abide by. Rather, we can devote ourselves totally to the service of God and learning His Torah and studies, and there will be peace throughout the world. We can all look forward to that time, and that will be through the stories of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and following that path. So we think of Lag BaOmer that's coming in this evening. It's still got an hour of light we got here in Chicago, but as we look forward to the sun setting when Lag BaOmer begins, so tomorrow is a great time. Tonight and tomorrow is a great time to get out in the field, go for a walk, learn some extra Torah, think a little bit about, set aside some time to think about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and the dedication to Torah and mitzvahs, the idea of bringing light to the world so that we can actually change the world over for good. These are all pursuits that we want to consider during the time of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Back to the idea of the...
Was the tree of life or the tree of knowledge? Are they interchangeable? There's two trees?
There are two trees. Yeah.
I said.
And if you look in the book of Genesis, it talks about both trees. So the beginning talks about don't eat from the tree that's in the center of the garden. This is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Up until that, they didn't know from good and evil. There was no other, there was only good. They didn't conceive of anything negative, anything contrary to God's will. How could he want people to think about it, right? But once they had succumbed to that idea, so then God hid the tree of life, because it wouldn't be fitting that people who sin should be around eternally. And that's not a punitive concept. It's actually the idea that if someone sinned and then death can atone for their sin and therefore earn eternal life. So it's not punitive, the punishments. They're all with a much bigger picture in mind. Again, the idea of the bonfires that Jeff brought in was the bonfire also brings out that idea of the light from the darkness. We can't appreciate, if you take a flashlight outside in broad daylight and you shine the flashlight and it's a high-powered flashlight, and you're so excited, and it does absolutely nothing. Makes no impression at all. But you go into a completely dark auditorium where there's not a stitch of light, and you turn on that flashlight. Wow, that's something, right? This is a dark world, a doubled and redoubled darkness. The mitzvahs that we do light up the darkness, light up the night. And the Zohar helps to light up, the Kabbalistic insights help to light up and shine a powerful light on the value of Torah and mitzvahs and acts of goodness and kindness. And that's the light that comes from the darkness. The mitzvahs that come in the midst of a gullus, in the midst of exile, are more powerful than what we do even in Israel. To live as a Jew in Israel is not this great accomplishment. It's not a fantastic accomplishment because that's the Holy Land already. But to live as a Jew in America, where you're free to not do so, you're completely free to do anything but, and you choose to do so, that is light in the darkness. I work with some of the active service members, and oftentimes you have people that are debating of whether they should wear a yarmulke or not with their uniform. And some, for some it's a challenge, for some it's not a challenge, and for some they've always done it, others are thinking about it. And to do so with pride makes a huge statement. Again, that's the light in the darkness. To stand up in the middle to stand up with pride in the middle of the darkness surrounding us is a tremendous light in the darkness, and that's all part of what the bonfire is a part of, and it's part of the studying of Zohar and the light of Chassidus in the midst of the gullus. Question time. Come on, Bob, throw one in there.
Yeah, I could start with one if you don't.
Go for it.
Let me diverge a little bit. Back to your introduction before we got to the reading. You mentioned that 7 weeks after leaving Egypt, the Jews were to go to Mount Sinai. Now, I was going to go do some research, but it's easier to ask. Did they know that at the time? How, and if so, how did they know beforehand that 7 weeks they would be at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah? Where was that told or foreordained?
So
I also wondered that.
Yep, good question. The time frame they did not know. And I'll tell you why in a minute. The time frame they did not know. The purpose of leaving Egypt, they did know. The purpose to come and serve God in the wilderness, that's part of the message that they gave to Pharaoh. We're going to go serve God. And we don't know how many sacrifices we're going to have to bring, so we have to take all of our cattle. And in fact, you're going to send us with some extras because we don't know how much we're going to need. But the idea of going to Mount Sinai to serve God, that was intrinsic in the idea of leaving. It wasn't leaving for leaving's sake, it was leaving for the sake of serving God. Why not know how long this journey is going to be? Part of the amazing, astounding, phenomenal, I'm going to backtrack for just a second. It's interesting that when we talk about the holiday of Passover, we call it Passover, which talks about passing over, which is what God did. He passed over our houses and saved us and slew the Egyptian firstborn, right? In the Torah, it's not called Passover. In the Torah, it talks about God's focusing on us, the season of our redemption and the greatness of the Jewish people. And our focus is on what God did for us. So when we left Egypt, it was with this tremendous faith that we're just following God into the desert with no idea how far we're going, how long we're going to be out here, what should we take with us, all those preparations. It was just God said we're going, and we said I'm with you. And so, not knowing how far we're going to go, how long this journey is going to be, contributes to the merit of our following God off out into the desert. So we knew what we were going to do, but we didn't know the timing for it.
So I was picking up on one particular comment you made, that they went out to receive the Torah. Did they know that they were going to, at some point in time, they were going to receive the Torah? Moses was going to go up the hill and pick it up and bring it back.
No, they knew that they were going to serve God, but they didn't know the details of what that meant.
Okay.
So
I think it was the way you phrased it before led me think, oh, that's interesting.
yeah.
They had a destiny to go, or a rendezvous point out there to go pick it up. Okay.
So Moses had an understanding of that, because it's at the burning bush when he first had this conversation with God to go back to Egypt and bring the Jews out. And that burning bush was at Mount Sinai. That's the same location. So we're going back to the same place he had his first revelation. So Moses knows what's kind of going down. What that'll look like, 10 commandments, tablets, and oral Torah, written Torah, didn't matter. Coming to serve God, whatever that looks like, whatever that entails. Retrospectively, we can figure out some of that stuff and the hints that we had, even going back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what that might look like. But, hindsight's 2020.
Sometimes.
Ron said he had a related question. I don't know if that scratched his
No,
itch.
what I said was I was thinking the same thing when the rabbi mentioned it, that did they really know they were going to get the Torah?
Okay, so you heard it the same way I
Oh,
heard it.
exactly.
Yeah.
We knew we're getting into something, but not sure what that would entail.
Okay.
If history is a lesson, then part of the lesson would be we're not good with time. Look what happened when they thought Moshe was supposed to have come down and he didn't come down. And look at other occasions where they anticipated something that wasn't ready yet.
Right. So good to just go with the flow and not overly anticipate and make expectations, because most of the times we get upset and frustrated is when our expectations are not met. And so we should be able to just go forward and not have preconceived notions of how it has to look like, because we can only be setting ourselves up for disappointment.
Another related question is how could we serve God if we didn't eat from the tree of knowledge? I mean, there'd be no way that we commonly think of to serve God. We serve God now by doing things that he commanded us to do, but there wouldn't be any need for these commandments if everything was perfect.
You are touching upon a big topic.
I'm asking for trouble. I don't mean to.
It
But
is
I
a
wonder
big
about things like
topic.
that.
And I'll give a teaser to the topic,
Okay.
which is, do you choose the easy route, or do you choose the more difficult way of getting it done? Do you choose what's easy, or do you choose what's difficult? If we go back to the Garden of Eden, and God said, don't eat from that tree of knowledge of good and evil. So Adam was like the engine. I was going to say, I'm not going to make another engineer joke, but Adam was like, okay, don't touch means don't touch, don't go there, right? Chava, Eve, was like, why did he say don't do that? What's with that? You know what? We'll accomplish more if we choose the hard way about this we could do this. Hey, Adam, come here, eat this.
We had a son. We had a son, a cute little guy.
Hard work is the devil's.
If we wanted him to not, if he wanted him to do something, all we had to say, "Don't do that."
Do
don't
it.
do
Yeah,
that." There was a surefire way to get him to do it.
I
And
remember
think there's
that
a lot of that at stake here.
the common rule for teenagers was if you want them to read, if you don't want them to read a book, leave it in open sight. If you want them to read a book,
Hide it.
kind of hide it.
Reverse psychology always works.
well, we were created with some curiosity in us. And
Mhm. And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
It
So
is,
that-
except when it leads us astray.
This is
Well-
true. That's where judgment comes in.
But
Right.
you know, there's this huge piece about and you know, we've talked about the hero's journey and that whole concept of the epic story of mankind. What do those look like? And it always comes down to the journey is the one we don't want to go on, but we can't help but go on. And in that journey, wow, what we get from that and what we can share from that is so powerful, but it's not a journey you'd choose to go on.
Like being drafted into the United States Army.
If you knew what was in store for
Right.
you, baby, oh man, you would
I
not.
wouldn't want to
do it.
repeat it, but I wouldn't miss the experience for the world.
I had this great class in character development with my cadets. We talked about, and it's part of the curriculum, comes from the Air Force, right? Part of that, and the curriculum is understanding the brain's developmental stages and how that frontal lobe, which is the decision-making part about how to weigh pros and cons, it's the last part to develop. And it really isn't fully developed until you're about 25, by which case you're already in the military by that time anyway.
And they barely did it. They drafted me when I was just past 24. So I had learned a lot already that kind of countervailed their attempt to rebuild this man.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to wrap up the class here, but stay on board for just a second. This was our class on Lag BaOmer.